Singaitla, good morning. Rit Yuan's Hanudukigava. Dana Morris is my English name. And I live in a beautiful part of the country called Haida Gwaii in BC. Has anybody here heard of Haida Gwaii? Wow, that's amazing. So I started as a comprehensive community planner in my community of Skidegate, which is about 900 people. And our islands are probably about 5,000 people in total that live there. It's very remote. For those of you that do not know where Haida Gwaii is, it's about 130 kilometers off the coast of BC in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's very remote and pristine. One of the things that we say in Haida Gwaii is, when the tide is out, the table is set. We can sustain ourselves off of the land. We can dig for clams, we can pick seaweed, we can harvest, we can walk at low tide and pick Dungeness crab from the ocean. We fish year-round. We fish for halibut, salmon. We have beautiful beaches where sometimes the waves, if the wind is blowing the right way and the tide is going the right way, we'll have a bounty thrown up onto our beach where we can just walk the beach and pick clams or pick crab or pick squid. It's a very beautiful, magical place. So you can imagine, we have a lot to protect on Haida Gwaii. We've had lots of threats to our community, things like the oil and gas industry. Something else I wanted to mention to you is Haida Gwaii is an archipelago of islands, so there's hundreds of islands that all come together to form Haida Gwaii. And if you were to stretch the coastline of Haida Gwaii, it would go all the way across Canada. So one of those threats we have is pollution, and things like garbage that goes into the ocean, as well as tsunami debris. So you can imagine going, we do tsunami debris trips, and we'll jump up onto the shore and look just below the rocks, and there it is, it's tons of garbage and debris. And we're thinking, like, what are we leaving for our future generations? When we go there now, we see artifacts, we see proof that our people had been there, and the only proof that we're going to leave that we were there is garbage. Another thing, I said that we're a small, remote island community, and our language is in critical danger of being lost. There are only a handful of fluent speakers that speak the Haida language, less than 1%. So that means that's 20 people that maybe speak the language, that are fluent. And those people are between the ages of 75 and 95 years of age. Those are our elders. And so we only have a handful of years left with those elders to create fluent speakers. And through our community planning process, one of our goals was to create one fluent speaker. And so that's part of how this project came to be. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about the project, but first, it feels odd for me to be here speaking about being the voice of my community, so I brought the voice of my community with me. Haida Gwaii is a unique, pristine place where we share common values, such as protecting our land and waters, and a deep understanding that everything depends on everything else, and that everything is connected. Comprehensive community planning is a community-driven process which embodies the voice of our community for the future of our community. So when we started this process in 2013, we wanted to go to the elders first and ask them what we should call our plan. And so I went to SHIP and met with the elders and explained what comprehensive community planning was. And the elders at SHIP translated it back to me into Haida.
Right, which is good, is
being together to talk, which is really a process that our people have been doing
forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it means a lot to us. And we go there with good, positive feelings. There's no negativity there. There's lots of happy feelings. And we share a wonderful meal, and We gather in groups, we talk about what we want to say, we either write it down ourselves or someone writes it for us. And that way we get out what we want to say and what we want to make our community a better place.
The key to a community is having young people in the room. And when it first started out, there wasn't many. And we've seen that shift. So there's a lot of young mothers in there and new grandmothers in there, you know. And that's probably the most important part of the whole concept, is ensuring that we get the young people in that room so that they walk out of there with an understanding that, hey, there's something happening here and it's for us.
Well, I think an important part of the community planning process is that staff and council also attend the comprehensive community plan meetings at a community member level, and also they bring it back into their work.
All of us, because we've gone to these meetings, are looking at what's on the walls, and then we start working towards getting some of the training initiatives that we're talking about, some of the trades and upgrading. And right now we have 4 amazing young boys in the interior doing an electrical program. We're getting to the point now where we're having difficulty finding clients who haven't had some of the training, you know, and we can take the roots of that process right back to the community planning process.
So our CCP is a roadmap for this council and future councils to have as a tool to track out.
So some of the directions of our comprehensive community plan were to protect our land and waters, and under that which makes us Haida, to revitalize our language, as well as to build a local economy. And one of the solutions to those directions, and the idea came from our community to create a film entirely in the Haida language. And through amazing partnerships with UBC, the School of Community and Regional Planning, who are also helping us with our CCP. We're also doing nation-to-nation mentoring through the community planning process, where we work with other First Nations communities. And one of those other partnerships was with Azuma TV, where we were able to share knowledge with Azuma, and they were able to help us create our own production company, create our own model for film, our own distribution plan, and mentor us in all of that. So I'd like to just also acknowledge Leonie Sandercock, who's in the audience here with UBC, School of Community and Regional Planning, and Jonathan France with Azuma TV. So thank you for being here with me today. And in case you missed it, the screening was last night. So it's called Edge of the Knife, so look for it in the future. And I was also part of the production team, amongst many other roles, and I look forward to answering your questions later. Hawa.
Ask the panelists to come up on stage and get seated. I also just want to quickly say that Michelle Latimer was planning to join us today, but unfortunately is unable to because of a family emergency, and she sends her regrets. Thank you so much for introducing your project with such generosity. It was amazing to hear it directly from you all, because I've been studying away. So I'm hoping we can maybe start with this question of initial invitations. So can each of you describe your methodology or approach to co-creation and participation? How do you make the initial contacts? How do you gather the collective, call the group together to start working on a project?
I guess I'll start. So when we set out to do a community source flood monitoring project, we actually didn't know what we were doing. We had ideas, but no one had ever tried using community source data, and even the National Weather Service didn't have a method outlined. So one of the things that we went into it was just this being humble, really being very clear and transparent. And we actually have no ego. So we were basically able to kind of invite the community to let us do this. We are a digital platform, but we realize that most of the people that we want to reach who are impacted by climate extremes may or may not be on Twitter or posting comments on the local newspaper. So we actually, we originally thought we were going to go to churches in this particular neighborhood where we were focusing on, but realized quickly that the community was really centered around local businesses. And so we put these comment boxes, we went really analog and said, tell us about flooding. And people just started giving us their names and their phone numbers and personal details, and we knew exactly where we could focus our efforts. And we started recruiting that way. And in 2 weeks we had 200 places that we needed to focus on. So we started that way, just being very mindful of our audience.
So as I mentioned, the making of the film Edge of the Knife started off as a community-driven process. And working with Leonie, we started doing workshops in both communities in the North End, in Skidegate, as well as in Old Masset, inviting everyone that was interested in film to come and watch some of the Zuma films that had already been made. And then we started doing script writing workshops in both communities. So we're slowly introducing our communities to the idea of film and how to write a script. And we hosted a script writing contest, and then we chose from those people a script writing team, and it was made up of people from the North End and the South End. And then as we went along, it was more about who was passionate about the project, and they were invited to participate. And it really took many, many hands on how to go out and make the film happen. We also had an advisory committee, so that we were making sure that things were done culturally correct.
So for the member project, we kind of two-level co-creation. One is the participants, how we co-creation together, because we are not NGO, we are not budget project. We're just some people who want to using this way to make a film. So we just said, if you want, if you think this interesting, you just come back, then come together, we discuss, and this is how it happened. The other thing, co-creation, is each person with one village. So like myself, I went back to my father's village. It's very hard to start to making people talking, and I lost my language in this village also. So I start to learn the language and to take long time to spend time with the old people. So we do a lot of workshop and to discussion how is to interview people, to collective the history. And we also think each of participants how to making their film continue in the same location. So that's what we are beginning to do the co-creation.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to sort of make visible all the informal or formal approaches and processes of inviting people to do work with you, right? That work is so hidden, so thank you for sharing that. I'm also curious, what possibilities or entry points do you see in these projects for people then, once they're invited, to take leadership within the project? And I see that, I mean, that is your story with Folk Memory Project, right?
So for leadership, we have a founder, Mr. Wen Guang, and in the beginning, of course, he's the leader. He said, you go back to the village, you start from the big famine. But after this, because we are more participants is young people, so he said, you need to working together to make decision what you are doing. So like we are building the library, is our discussion to make these things. So that's why I'm here. It's not him. he want me to come here. Do you want to say something?
My name's Odette Scott. I lived in Chalchandi Workstation for about 3 years before the Memory Project started, and then so I kind of saw how the project evolved out of working with the villagers and then working with young filmmakers to go back to their roots in the village. And since then, I don't have my own Chinese village to go back to, but I've been helping with translation and witnessing kind of the process of the workshops and everything. And Mengqi's rocking this, but she asked me to be here, so I'm really happy. I think also in the village working with these kids, and the kids were really curious about their grandparents who they'd never really talked to about the past. And so the kids kind of took a bit of a leadership role in the project over time, didn't they? Yeah.
So our film couldn't have happened without our fluent language speakers, so they had to take the lead role in the project. Anyone involved with the project had to have an interest in the language, whether or not it was the actors who took on the responsibility of having to learn the language in order to make the film, as well as our language support people, those people that are already working in the language that could be on set with us, that could help the actors through their scenes, that could practice with them, help them with memorization, as well as our fluent elders to make sure that we got it right all along the way.
I just wanted to, I didn't have time to kind of elaborate on some of the previous pilot work that we did, but we are really focused on this question and really are questioning the concept itself. When we launched a pilot in Harlem with urban heat sensors, and we invited residents to host the sensors and tell us stories about, and it was an incredible success. We monitored indoor heat. We proved that indoor heat waves behave very different than heat waves outside. And we're doing public health advisories all wrong, and we won awards, we published papers, got tons of media coverage, and then when we invited the community members and leaders to come back for a workshop to discuss what was next, a fraction of the people who had participated in our project was able to come. And that's because a lot of our leadership venues are 4-hour meetings on a Saturday, or 3 hours at night. And if you've got multiple jobs or kids or other things that you're doing, you just really don't have time for that. And so there's inequity in the concept of leadership as we engage it. So we really started seeing IC Change as an equity tool when we started working in New Orleans. We wanted to reach those who are leaders in their own ways, like the soul food restaurant owner who we co-curated this exhibit with. It's not like he had time to sit down with us and review it. We actually had to show him images that we, selected from the community that he wanted to highlight while he was cooking. And we played audio pieces for him. We had to have hairnets and put audio, so he invited his entire community, had a bounce house, and a lot of people showed up because we were able to engage him where he was. With Destiny and this, and just the kind of the larger resilience conversations that are happening, we need leaders on every block, right? So we didn't teach her anything about hydrology. She learned it just by using the tool and paying attention, and then started telling us other things that we didn't know. And then she started reaching out to all of her neighbors around her and checking on them during flood events. Does she still have time to go to these resilience meetings? No, I got her to go to one, but her stories and her information went straight to the people who are needing to hear it. And so I really want to hear the concept of leadership. Like, neighborhood association meetings are fantastic, but only if you have the time to go. And so I really do question that, and I want to invent around it and hear from you all.
Yeah, I mean, the shift from content creator to owner or leader within a project is truly what makes the co-creative process transformative and strengthens the work, right? I also want to ask, as artists or media makers, community organizers, we might have certain intentions and visions of a project before we begin, but in this process, because we're accountable to the communities we're working with, we have to learn to let go of some things. We edit, we iterate, And so I'm wondering, can you share if you have any stories of letting go, of editing?
Yeah, I can say something right away about that. So when I first got to see the rough cut of the film, I think we had 3 hours of footage, and to be on set and be involved in those different scenes, some of them were so amazing, and we knew that our ancestors were with us while we were making that scene, and then to see it not necessarily be in the feature film was hard, but at the same time, we wanted to create a feature film and it had to be cut down, but we plan on making a second full-length film that will focus on using our language as a resource and include all of those wonderful scenes.
Because we are all people making our own documentary, so for the whole project, if there's a change or something is the history change. When we interview the old people over 1 year, 2 years, it's more and more from the big famine, cultural revolution to into the personal history. So this topic change itself. So we are not too thinking about how to say the documentary, how to change. It's more like how the village people, the reality of village change us, the idea.
So I think editing is essential to everybody's process, right? You get a better product out of it. And again, that equity issue came up with us when we actually, when we were doing our flooding work in New Orleans, we had a little bit of an artist in residency program support us, you know, and it was really lovely. But our original idea is like any kind of proposal format, right? You have ideas, you kind of set up milestones for yourself. So we had one around like all the artists in the neighborhood in New Orleans like contributing and coming. And yet, you know, again, equity, we didn't have enough money to pay them to do that, you know. So that was something that we let go, and we kind of found new ways to engage creativity in our collaborative work. But also, there was a moment where we had like a presentation moment at a festival, and ironically, the festival was rained out. So, you know, just being very mindful of that, you know, and then so we just instead set up a pop-up, and it, you know, and moved it, and again brought the conversation to the blocks that we needed to talk to.
I'm curious, I'm going to put like a little spin on this question. I'm wondering what kind of hard decisions you've had to make with the groups you're working with around preserving like the vulnerability of someone's story and it turning possibly into like spectacle or voyeurism. Like what kind of like editing happens in those conversations?
For us, because, and we learned this again from the Harlem Heat project as well, working with people in public housing, we didn't necessarily want people to know exactly where they were and exactly what their data was, but they wanted to share it nonetheless. And so we've also figured out in New Orleans with flooding, you know, people sharing their exact location, and like another question that came up for us is this notion of open data and where open data can be vulnerable, right? If you share information about flooding, we don't want people's insurance rates to change or their real estate values to change. So we've worked really, really hard to make obfuscation available on mapping, and we're going to be rolling that in the next few months. Because it's essential for people to feel safe, but yet contribute to that collective knowledge.
Yes, of course, we collective the many stories are painful and suffering. And there's one example in my film. There's one old lady, she talking about his son passed away. So it's really pain story. She's bearing this dead son's memory every day. So for me, as a documentary filmmaker, it will be a very good story in the film. But I choose to not to tell the story like dramatical things. I let the lady speak again. So I think maybe speak out is like a treatment for her, and also I don't push her to talk what she don't want to talk. just listening again and again. Then I show her the film. She feel it's okay, and when we are screening in the village, there's a lot of village people, like neighbor of her. They saw this story. Even the son passed away 15 years. The neighbor just forget about these sons. So they start to think, oh, this woman, she's still suffering, and we need to help her. So yeah, this is the.
Yeah, and I believe the same thing happened to us. So as First Nations people, we've had our language taken from us, and we've had so much taken from us. Through residential school, there was a lot of shame if you tried to speak your language. And that historical trauma has carried on to the future generations. And so being able to speak your language and be proud of speaking your language, you have to go over that shame and get through it and feel comfortable making a mistake. So that was a huge process in the filmmaking, as well as a lot of the scenes that we did were traumatizing, very traumatizing. A lot of people had personal experiences of losing a child or losing someone to drowning. And just being in the location where we were in a traditional village that had been decimated, the population, and there were remains while we were seeing while we were shooting the film all over the place. We had to be very sensitive to where we went in the village, and to just be present where there had been so much trauma. It really went through our people while we were living on set and filming. So.
I think there is a really important line between re-traumatizing and healing. Like being, with climate change in particular, there's and with any kind of disasters or kind of living with these kinds of vulnerabilities, there's a degree of trauma stewardship in our work, right? That we really need to be mindful of. That none of us are trained counselors, and yet we find ourselves in those positions all the time. And I think that it's that dialoguing that is so essential, so that it doesn't feel that people are putting themselves out there and feeling exposed.
And definitely film is definitely a catalyst for healing in community.
Storytelling, for sure. On the way here, I was telling someone about my work who was driving my Lyft, and she just threw down about Katrina, and we haven't had these conversations all the time. We're many, many years out, and just knowing that there are certain spaces in our community that people don't feel comfortable going to the convention center, don't feel comfortable going to the airport, and it's still alive, and yet there's new demographics that have come in and shifted the narrative and forgotten it, and it really makes us vulnerable. So it's important to remember, but it's important not to traumatize.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for drawing that line. It is very fine. I want to switch and talk about specificity a little bit. So each one of your projects is mining specificity. You're producing projects that speak to specific community experiences, which allow you all to dig deeper and do some cross-cutting work. With I See Change, for example, your members are able to produce stories about environmental racism or stories that make connections between economic justice and climate justice. With Edge of the Knife, you talked about this in your intro a little bit, a set of community planning goals have developed with the council beyond language revitalization to include things like economic development. I'm wondering if each of you can speak a little more about intersectionality in your practices or projects, like because you're able to get specific, what kind of cross-cutting work are you able to do?
I think specific is the only way to learn. We can have big picture ideas, but until we actually execute on them, then we don't actually see their value. And so even though I See Change was global, and we have people all over the world, we realized that actually having whole communities use us to focus on the things they care about was the only way to actually have impact, and then be able to launch that again at scale. So in New Orleans, we started seeing people telling us about areas of the city we didn't know were flooding, even though we had kind of focused on the area where the city was doing a lot of work. And we just see that, for us, storytelling, we've removed ourselves from just this walls of discipline, right? And we're seeing that storytelling and engagement can be used in problem scoping, dialogue and design, evaluation, and then financing. Who knew, right? And so as we say to the city, we take the community stories and show the city, hey, this area of the city, people are cut off and they are gonna be in trouble. And this is also a super fun site, and it shouldn't be flooding. And here's how the community is impacted. we didn't go to the journalists necessarily, which was been our traditional route. It took it straight to the city, and now it's on their map to actually do something about it. And then in the work that we're doing around HUD-funded infrastructure, there is open questions about how we're going to design these, and the community's knowledge needs to be included. And for engineers, like having conversations about story or dialogue or healing or trauma is not a comfortable place. So we've been able to code switch, frankly. A lot of the work is around sharing stories and code switching and seeing what the value is across different disciplines.
And I think in terms of edge of the knife, I think it's sort of reversed in being specific. So initially, the film was created to revitalize our language, put an influx of funding into our economy and look for a long-term goal of economic development and production in film, because we've had so many filmmakers come to Haida Gwaii and make film about Haida Gwaii, but never anyone on Haida Gwaii make a film about Haida Gwaii. So that was the first time ever. But now, the idea started with the Skidegate community, but they realized this is bigger than us. And so that's why we had approached the Council of the Haida Nation and the village of Old Masset. And now that the film and then we had to reach out to Alaska, to the Haidas in Alaska. So it's just been growing and growing and growing. And now this film has become a catalyst for language revitalization for Haida people, but also for examples for other small First Nations that need to focus on revitalizing their language. So we're an example for them, but also mentoring, the importance of mentoring, and how you can transfer that knowledge amongst ourselves, at no cost. And so being mentored by Azuma, and now hopefully the Haida Nation will also be working with other First Nations to mentor them in filmmaking.
For me, I'm not sure I'm clear about the question, but I want to say is, for Chinese people, as I before said, we are just learn freelance in the after 1898. So now we learn a new word is community. We don't have community. Where all the people is start to be a freelance, who want to be a free, but we don't know how to community together. So for Memory Project is most of us is a filmmaker, a dancer. We can do what we want to speak, to performance. But why we need to together and doing the history things? We are not the history sculpture or students. So all of these, no matter of the interview, collective, the history, also the making artwork, is all about making or try to do the communities, try to build communities.
So in my own practice, I have a project called Iyaka Repository, where we host workshops with people of African descent and develop and design speculative futurist objects. In hosting these workshops, we have these heavy conversations around the violence affecting us presently. And as the facilitator of those workshops, I'm kind of left as keeper of these stories when the workshop ends and people walk out the door. And with Folk Memory Project, I read a story about I read an interview where you briefly describe meeting an elderly woman who shortly passed after you left the village, and you realize that the woman had maybe 2 photos of her, and you took one of them. And it gave you new responsibility. So there's a weight to doing this kind of work. And I'm wondering, how do you understand this weight, and what kind of coping or self-care practices are embedded in the work you're doing?
Well, during production, we had to have a lot of self-care in our traditional way. So we had about 60 people living on set for maybe a month at a time, like 4 or 5 days in a row, working long hours, and we were tired, cold, not hungry because we were well fed. That's one of our self-care, was eating really good local food, as well as starting off each day, in our traditional way, with prayer and with our circle and grounding exercises, as well as ending the evening like in a circle singing around a fire. So that was self-care during that. And I think, yes, there is a lot of weight to the project itself. And I think the most important weight that we have right now is when are we starting the next one? Because our people want to see this continue.
Okay, yeah, so it's about how to healing self, maybe, right? Yeah, protect myself. So you see we are doing performance. I'm a performer and I'm a dancer, but all the other participants, they are not treating as performers. But we use the theater and dance workshop together to heal self, maybe, because when you are in the stage or you are in the floor, you're opening your body with the story, and you try to use your body to feeling the difficult story. So it's something change. So that's why we very want to do the performance every year. And even we don't have the place to perform in, we still do the workshop. So this is kind of way we are together to care or something.
This question is something that I've been thinking about more deeply than I think I appreciated. I think that IC Change, we created IC Change as a healing place for dialogue, to come up with solutions, for us to all connect to each other, and that happens with our community. We ask them for their feedback, and they find using us gives them healing when we're watching something really profound and asking something of us in humanity that doesn't quite exist yet to be able to handle what's happening with climate change. And we kind of are a navigating tool in that process, but I watch every post that comes in, every story, and it doesn't escape me that as a mom and as a resident of the Gulf Coast with 3 family members across one of the most vulnerable states, that this is personal to all of us, but and that there's this trauma stewardship that's happening. And someone at a recent presentation, there was questions, but they didn't get to this one, and it was so profound. The interactions that individuals have with IC Change seem to have a cathartic and positive psychological effects of being heard. Have you investigated this effect in a scientific way? No, but we think we have the ways to do it. But I certainly am not immune to just the emotional spaces that we're kind of opening up. I mentioned in the slide that I come from 2 cultural communities, and I was never raised Jewish, but as a 40-year-old woman, I think I've come into a need for a religious space in my life. And I found that really interesting, as an adult, to kind of be seeking something out. And I think the Jewish faith for me is also like a collective thing where everyone's like asking questions all the time. And I went to services for Yom Kippur, and it had Gandhi's 7 social sins written into the text. And I looked at them and I was like, oh, this is everything to me right now, and I'm just going to read them. The 7 social sins, according to Gandhi, were wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, commerce without that's another one, I'm just kidding. Commerce without morality, science without humanity, that's one that we've definitely been tackling, worship without sacrifice, and politics without principle.
Well, I just wanted to add one more thing. So I talked about how we were grounding our work in our culture, and that's part of our healing practice. And in the Haida language, we do not say goodbye. We say aganpakingaska, which means look after yourself.
Thank you so much. I want to take this time now to open it up for a Q&A. We have about 10 minutes for questions. And we have mics.
Good morning. Thank you guys so much. My name is Haria Muhammad, and I'm here representing the Black TV and Film Collective. I'm just really honored to be here sharing this conversation with you. And Julia, my question specifically is how do you go about building the trust in communities, and how do you go about maintaining that trust?
Great question. And it's essentially what we're aiming to do. It's part of our mission. I think that it starts with you tell us, we're not telling you. First of all, we're not trying to teach you. We just want you to teach us. So starting off from that place of like, we know nothing, which is the best place to start. Tell us how weather and climate impact you. If it does, what do we not, tell us whatever you want to tell us, keep it open. And then as we build the trust, as we start to see patterns, we say, okay, well, we've noticed that you've posted about flooding at this intersection 6 times. Would you like to host a rain gauge? Would you like to do this? And even when we started creating materials after we started learning things, going and honoring local leadership. So we went to the Soul Food Folk, the only restaurant in this neighborhood, and said, you are the leader here. Tell us how you want your community to process all this stuff that we've learned. And just really honoring that local leadership. And then even evaluating and coming back to all the people who got involved in what we did. We asked them, well, so how was that experience for you? Be honest, tell us. That evaluation moment after we create and launch something into the world is so often missing. And it doesn't have to be that formal survey or whatnot, just be a conversation, a dialogue.
Gotcha. And I was really wondering if you could be more specific, like when you decide, for example, to go into the Harlem housing project, did you pass out flyers? Did you locate somebody there and then start a dialogue with that person who the community trusted, and then like that person be the bridge? If you could be more specific.
Absolutely. For the Harlem pilot, that was a learning moment for us. And I don't know, we came from, the Royal We, I See Change. We had started working collaboratively with scientists, and that was kind of something that was a little bit of a third rail for journalism. In traditional journalism, you're supposed to go and find a community group and find a voice in there and get that story and then present it as and present that story as the narrative that you're saying, and completely maybe even erase the fact that it was a community group that had already been working with this community of people in public housing. So in Harlem Heat, we actually partnered with a local environmental organization called We Act for Environmental Justice, who has door-to-door relationships with people in Harlem that they've been cultivating for a really long time. And we said, we're not gonna go and try and get that story from you all. Come work with us. Like in journalism, like partnering with a group like that of activists or engaged, community groups is kind of like the third rail. And I've started to really question that relationship because we're just hiding the process often when we present a story, right? And just being like, no, we're all in it together. We're just trying to find out the information, what we need to do, and being a lot more humble.
There was a question over here.
Thank you guys for this discussion. My name is Asega, and I'm a filmmaker. My question to you all was on this, while you were talking about this idea of trauma stewardship, and when you're asking people stories, when you're talking to people that have been traumatized, have there been times when you thought that the harm that would come from a person telling their story outweighed the good? And were there times when you asked community members not to share their story, or there was a decision not to share and keep something within the community? And what was sort of, what's the story connected with that?
I think every good storyteller has that question and should ask it, and I've certainly done it. I think it's important. Not specific, for a couple of media collaborations with I See Change, we worked with WBEZ on looking at immigration and how it's related to climate change. They're intimately related. And so really talking to undocumented workers about actually the real reason why they came and what pushed them over here, which was the collapse of small-scale farming due to climate change in Central America. And a lot of those folks, we decided, let's not use their last names, let's not use photos. So we came up with animations. And they were beautiful and actually much more powerful, I think, because it lended a personality to the story, but it also universality to it as well.
one of our other Haida laws is to ask permission first. So definitely in the making of this film, the question was posed to us about what we could share and what we were not allowed to share. Of course, I can't share that with you. But we do have some rules around things like traditional medicines. That information is very sacred. So you do see a little bit of some of it in the film, but you don't really get any details. Same with the supernatural. Remember, supernatural stories and locations, those are also things that we don't share. I will mention, though, that in one of the scenes in the film, the wailing scene, that was shot in such a way that we could only do that once. Because there's no way we could have put our actors through that trauma a second time. So it was only shot once.
Because we are asking the specific history, and these old people is the last generation who know what's the past. So when we ask for Commemory Project, the big famine, some people, they are always afraid to say something. There's some shadows behind the memory. They know what the story they cannot say. They know what the story they can say. So sometimes the village leader, they don't say anything with us. This is in the history, but in the personal history, there's another woman. She said about the husband treat her very bad, beat her. So I started thinking, how can I use it or I don't use it, because it's too pain and they are still living together. If I put this in my film, it will hurt her life. So she started to talking this story again. She really want to yell out the story, the pain. So I said, maybe we stop to say these pain things. Let's do another things. So we do singing and dancing together. So I don't put the husband beat her story in my film. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? There's one in the back.
Hi, my name's Alex Hawken. I'm the director of the America's Media Initiative. And I have a question about the Folk Memory Project. And I was just wondering if you've had any issues with the Chinese government just giving you any problems, especially in terms of some of the testimony that you've been gathering.
Yes, we got something problem, but it's not a big problem. The most problem is not from the government. It's always from around us. It's like family problem, and also the young people not interesting about history. So for myself, my mother is always support me. She try to understand what I'm doing, and I don't make big money for my life. And the other, they're doing something crazy in the winter time, so cold. Yeah, and the other member all has the family problem. The mother and the father don't agree with them to doing these things. And in the village, especially the village parents, they feel it's very dangerous. So from outside, from the government, we have a blog, we have our social media. We cannot put the oral history part in our blog. They just destroy this blog like 4 years before. So we make a new blog, but we can put the history part inside. We can share what, like today, what we shared here. I will write something and put our social media. This is okay. And there's one time we are performing in a experience Vienna in Shanghai. They plan to perform in 5 shows, but when we do the second shows, they cancel it. So the government afraid the people knowing us, but it's the true thing is our blog is really few people to look in. So people don't interesting the history part. There's a lot of words. They want to maybe some new things. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Marielle Belanger. I am from the Okanagan Nation in British Columbia. I am a filmmaker as well and a scriptwriter. I just recently wrote a script about my community. In my community, it's a personal family story. This question is for Dana. How did you convince, I noticed that you're on the band council, maybe that's how, no? But how did you convince your band council that filmmaking is actually a real economic development?
Well, it was actually the community that directed council to make the film. And so the council does really support the community planning process. And we did go to council first and ask for support to continue with the project. And we had a letter of support from them, but they're the ones that also said, no, this is bigger than us. We need to make sure this is for our nation. So we had to go to the Council of the Haida Nation and ask them for support. And we were able to get a letter of support from them right away with our grant writing process. And then it was harder actually because we had to work with Skidegate and Old Masset, and we have a history of not working well together. It's always like a competition between the two bands. So it was a really healing process to bring both bands to work together on this project and have it equally between Skidegate and Old Masset.
Okay, so we have actually time for one more question. I have questions that I can still pull from, but I'd rather take audience questions first. There's one back there.
Good morning, and thank you. My name is Marco Williams. I make pictures, and I guess what I'm wrestling with, and I wonder for all of you, about the tension of a kind of arrogance that we have as authors or authority or being in a position of power, that we think that what we are about to do or our idea is going to make a difference. And that drives us. We believe that if we get access or if we complete this, we're going to affect change. And we take that concept and bring it to varying communities. They could be our own community. They could be a community that we're less familiar with and we're willing to engage or try to engage. And so I just would love to hear from each of you about how you're managing your, I'm going to talk about me, I guess, but how do you manage an arrogance of belief with the reality that our enterprise may not make a difference at all?
Well, I can say for Edge of the Knife, our biggest fear out of doing this project, it was 5 years of work to create the film and to eventually show it to our communities. We had a screening in Skidegate and a screening in Old Masset. Was, are people gonna come? And what are they gonna think about the film afterwards? And so we had put Dotmocracy up on the wall where we'd ask them, how do you rank this film? Total flop, and at the other end of it, amazing, let's do it again. And people were each given a dot, and in Skidegate we had 500 people show up, which is amazing for a small community of 900. And in Old Masset we had over 600 people show up. So it's pretty amazing that our numbers could have filled a major theater. And all of the stickers were on the let's do this again. But, so we knew that our community was behind us with this project, but the film is full of Haida culture and language and full of our traditional stories that everybody on Haida Gwaii is familiar with. How is the rest of the world gonna take this film, not understanding why they're doing this or why they're doing that, and their heads might be filled with all of these questions. So that's still out there. We don't know really how the rest of the world is going to accept this film.
This is a great question. And I think that letting go of authorship is like one of the first steps in that question, to answering it at least. That was, when IC Change, I think that creating space for failure also, and acceptance of failure, is actually the best thing you could ever do in any of these creative endeavors. So I think that this paradigm of co-creation actually invites us to know that not everyone is going to experience this the same way, that we're trying something totally different. And the more we push, I have, the Achilles heel of always pushing the frontier, and that always keeps me a little bit honest with myself, trying to say, okay, well, this could totally fail. And being comfortable with that, riding that dragon of that, it's hard, but I think, and just making sure that as best as we can, that we're taking our leave from others, and that we're just letting go of self and ego in this. In this kind of co-creation discussion, there's just this notion that, and it's a tension with the idea of the independent producer, like who's able to do this stuff, right, in their ego and the name and whatever. But the truth is, there's no real original ideas, maybe even, right? I think James Gleek wrote about the book The Information, kind of going through the history of innovation and how we maybe associate, for example, Darwin, right? We give him theory of evolution. That was his baby. Made a difference. Actually, there was another guy on the other side of the world doing the same thing. He was pretty close to figuring it out. And we're kind of always on the precipice of evolving and inventing at the same time, and in synergistic ways, and being a little bit more comfortable with that notion, I think.
So speak about change. I really I can change something in the village, in the community. But actually, the village people don't think I have any power. For them, because for them they said maybe she don't have job. Why she's in the yeah, because I spend, the village is always old people and the kids. Like my age, if you are stay there more than three days, they think you are a problem outside of city. You lost your job, so they think I don't have a job. But I keep come back. So now it's the 8 years. So they start to know, oh, this girl maybe have job, but this is another job. And finally, this winter I buy a second car. I can drive a car to my home, to the village. They say, oh, this girl earn money. So now maybe they think, maybe I have a little bit power for help them to do something. But for myself, I'm really, struggle, because you see the little girl, she's growing up, is very well and very happy of her. But the other boy is her brother. He is the first one who really support me doing all the things in the village. But the parents think he get the age to go to outside to working and money, then he quit to the school. He don't back to the school, so he start to earn money outside. He stop with connect with me, and he stopped to back to the village to doing something with me. So it's make me thinking, what can I change? I don't know, maybe something, maybe nothing. But I think I still has the base to do something, because the little girl come. Yeah, maybe another small kids will do the same with me.
That's such an important note to maybe end on, is that the scale of change is co-determined, and maybe that's what tames our arrogance and our ego, right? That we don't have to change the world, we can change the block, we can be focused on changing the neighborhood, the town, the village, right? So just considering always and co-determining with the groups we're working with where change happens and how it's supposed to look. Thank you all so much for this conversation.